It's the Kyle Hyman Show on Redeemer Radio.
This is Kyle Hyman, and joining us to talk about the document Christus Vivit and what it has to do with digital media is our digital media and journalistic expert, Bill Schmitt. Thanks for being here, Bill.
Well, very good to be here, Kyle.
Good. You wrote an article over on your website, onward.net. That's onword.net, talking about this document put out by Pope Francis, geared towards youth. We talked about it yesterday with Katie Pashon-McGrady about what it means for young adults and for youth. Kind of curious, we didn't really mention anything about digital media. Why do you think that there is an emphasis on digital media in this document for youth and young adults?
Well, that's a good question, and I think it ties back to our Pope's wonderful ability to see connections between things. And he's talked in the past about concerns about digital media and social networks, etc. And sure enough, he sees the connections. He writes about them in relatively small sections of those 30,000 words. But I searched them out with a little bit of digital help. And I was fascinated, just as I've been fascinated with his World Communication Today messages about communications and media in his 2018 and 2019 messages at those times. And it's all of a piece, and it's all stuff that's, I think, worth discussing.
Yeah. And I know he's both mentions the positive things about digital media and some of the challenges. Would you say in this document specifically, does Pope Francis go a little bit more pro-digital media or anti-digital media?
Well, it's a balanced approach. He does say that there is a strength to social media. Of course, he uses it himself, and it can bring people together, and it can give a voice to people who don't have it before, and thank God it's giving a voice to a lot of folks among Catholics and others of goodwill to bring forth some great messages of evangelization and catechesis and all of that. Mm-hmm. But to me, it sounds a little bit like net he's coming down on the side of some profound concerns that we might be headed in the wrong direction.
Do you want to talk a little bit about some of those concerns?
Well, he sees a lot of toxic potential in the way we're approaching communication through the technology and the culture of the technology of communication. And we're approaching communication in ways, such as some of the community-forming software that we use every day. We're building communities that are more prone toward exclusion than inclusion, and more toward enragement than toward engagement, you might say. Yeah. And he's saying that these can be, they can wreak all sorts of havoc, especially in young people's lives, but in everybody's lives, because we're all kind of, avid consumers of news through these media, and we're all publishers and journalists, in a sense. We're putting this out ourselves,
right?
And without too much forethought. In the old days, of course, and to some degree still today, news media were governed a little bit by what they used to call gatekeepers, editors, folks like that, who'd kind of say, are you sure you mean this? Are you sure you've checked your sources? Are you sure that your sources are named? Are you sure that you're saying things in an objective, balanced way? Have you sought out both sides or more sides of the story? Right. And those things we don't tend to cogitate when we punch out a tweet or a Facebook post or anything like that.
So one of the things that you talk about in your article and point out is the idea of loneliness within,
yes.
and it's one of those kind of ironic things that as we are more connected, in some ways, we are also isolating ourselves more.
Yes, that's a really good point. Yeah, let's see. He talks that he has a section called on the digital media, and he talks about loneliness as one of the side effects. Here's a quote: "It is not healthy to confuse communication with mere virtual contact. Indeed, the digital environment is also one of loneliness, manipulation, exploitation, and violence, even to the extreme case of the dark web." And of course, he mentions in particular forms of creating loneliness and sadness and disconnection, such as cyberbullying and pornography, and all the different ways in which people exploit themselves and others through social media.
So I mean, a lot of these things, it has a direct correlation or a direct connection to our youth and young adults. But also, I mean, since adults are on these platforms as well, this really kind of affects everybody, doesn't it?
It really affects everybody. And we have the same responsibilities that used to be kind of de rigueur for professional journalists, and to some degree they still are. I think especially in local journalism, which sadly is kind of in its death throes in its own right. There's still that sense that, we're speaking to a community in which we belong. And so we have responsibility to the young people in our community and to the parents of the kids going to the schools that we're reporting on and everything. But it's so easy, especially in the national media, and when we're kind of anonymous creatures just kind of wandering cyberspace, we don't really care about who, or we don't think about enough, the people that we're writing to. Whom are we hurting? Whom are we dismissing with just plain old simplistic labels? And what the Pope himself calls disinformation and fake news. Those were terms that he used in his 2018 World Communications Day message, and he's just gotten kind of more powerful and poignant and pointed in his 2019 message, and now in Christus Vivit.
Yeah. We're talking with Bill Schmitt about the digital media implications of the document Christus Vivit from Pope Francis. And one of the things that you talk about is this idea of, I think it has to do with curation. So we can choose who to follow and what sources we want to, either follow on Facebook or like as well.
Right.
But then also there's an algorithm that's happening in the background that is feeding us the media that it thinks we'd be the most interested in based on our previous engagement with posts and stuff. And so then we end up with a very specific and biased source of information. What do you see as the pros and the cons of that?
The pros and cons of just stating one side of the story?
Yeah.
Kind of, yeah.
Because, I mean, on one side, I think it's nice for me to be able to get the information that I'm most interested in, and getting the perspective of the Catholic Church, for example, and not have something that's biased anti-Catholic. But at the same time, I think there's dangers of that. Yes, yeah.
We absolutely should take advantage of all of the resources that Catholics and others are, giving us that can uplift us and inform us in more detail about all of the things that are going on and all of the things constructive that we can get involved in. But he says at one point, I think it's in the 2019 World Communications Day message, we have to be engaged in conversations with other people. It's the whole idea of encountering and accompanying people as well as listening. He talks about the passages in the Bible about how, in a true community in the body of Christ, the eye has a great role, but it cannot say to itself, well, I want to be the nose or I want to perform all the functions of the body. We have to understand that everybody is forming this community for a reason. Everybody's bringing their own gifts as a creature of great human dignity, and that all of those points of view at least need to be understood and engaged with, not agreed with necessarily.
Right.
But what we can do is understand them better if we are well fed by the Catholic combination of faith and reason, and all of those other points of view that make our news consumption more reasoned and more centered on human dignity.
Yeah. So what other advice does Pope Francis have for responsible use of modern media?
Well, he does certainly talk a lot about prayer as job one. And back in 2018, and one of the things that captivated me enough to even write a book about it, he cited the Peace Prayer of St. Francis, which is all about self-donation and kind of standing in the gap with other people who are in need and not mocking them or dismissing them or marginalizing them. So those kinds of humble words of prayer can guide us a lot. And he talks about the need for seeking truth. And that's the danger of disinformation. All of those algorithms, etc., they're feeding our cultural proclivity toward relativism, where we just form our own truth.
Right.
And that's pretty dangerous. And it's very interesting that we're entering an age where we're kind of totally into relativism and at the same time totally into moralism, trying to, we feel this urgent need to improve the world and to make the world a good place, but without some kind of common ground of truth that can bring us all together. Each of us is kind of playing God to enforce our own understanding of the truth, and so that doesn't lead to communication. We really need to see the potential for learning and listening and really making these social communities what maybe they were originally designed for, namely true community building. And the Catholic faith has that wonderful instinct for being, in many ways, a global big tent of a lot of different perspectives, certainly within the confines and guardrails of the Church's 2,000 years of time-proven wisdom on what works and what doesn't work. And we have to be willing to share those, but we have to share them in charity.
Yeah. Well, encourage people to check this out. You did a great job of pulling out some quotes and then explaining them a little bit. Check out the article, onward.net, onword.net. I know you got another post scheduled for tomorrow, so people can check that out as well. Thank you so much, Bill. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Always good to talk to you, Kyle.